My daughter-in-law sent me a box of cupcakes, and the next day she called and asked, "Did you like the little cakes?" I replied, "I gave them to your mother, she loved them." At that moment my daughter-in-law went silent, then screamed desperately, "You did what?" That was when I realized she had tried to destroy me. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Helen Carter. For 40 years I was a history professor, a wife, and a mother. I believed my life was a quiet, open book. This is the story of how I discovered a secret, murderous plot written in the margins, and how I wrote a final, devastating chapter of my own. The cupcakes arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a Trojan horse disguised as a peace offering. My daughter-in-law, Simone, appeared on my doorstep, a rare and surprising event in itself. Her visits had become less and less frequent since my husband, Frank, had passed away, dwindling from monthly duty calls to the occasional perfunctory holiday appearance. But here she was, dressed in an impeccably tailored cream-colored pantsuit, her smile as bright, as wide, and as breathtakingly artificial as a pageant queen's. "Helen," she'd said, her voice a symphony of the most effusive and most fraudulent affection. She'd enveloped me in a hug that was all sharp angles and expensive perfume, a gesture that felt less like an embrace and more like a strategic occupation of my personal space. "I was just in the neighborhood and I thought of you." In her hands she held a beautiful Tiffany blue box, tied with a pristine white satin ribbon. "I brought you something," she'd said, her eyes shining with a practiced and deeply convincing sincerity. "I know how much you've been struggling with your sugar levels lately, and I felt so terrible that you can't enjoy any of the nice things in life. So I made these for you myself." She opened the box with a flourish, revealing a dozen of the most exquisite cupcakes I had ever seen. They were perfect, each one a miniature work of art, topped with a swirl of what looked like buttercream frosting and a delicate, crystallized violet. "It's a special recipe I developed," she'd continued, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Completely custom-made just for you. They're low-sugar, diabetic-friendly. I used a special all-natural sweetener, so you can eat as many as you want without having to worry. It's our little secret." I am ashamed to admit, completely and totally disarmed. The gesture was so thoughtful, so specific, so seemingly born of a deep and previously well-hidden well of affection, that it overwhelmed my quiet and long-standing reservations about her character. I had always found Simone to be a little too polished, a little too ambitious, a little too interested in the size of the inheritance my son Michael would one day receive. But in that moment all of my doubts, all of my suspicions, were washed away by a wave of pure, unadulterated and deeply, deeply foolish gratitude. "Simone, sweetie," I'd said, my own voice thick with an emotion I could not quite name. "You didn't have to do this. They're beautiful." "Of course I did," she'd said, her smile never wavering. "You're my husband's mother. Your family. And family takes care of each other." She hadn't stayed long, of course. She had another appointment, another important meeting to get to. She had left me there in the quiet of my own home, with the beautiful Tiffany blue box sitting on my kitchen counter, a silent, and as I would soon learn, deeply malevolent testament to her love. I had stared at the cupcakes for a long time, my heart a complicated mixture of gratitude and a quiet and deeply unsettling sense of confusion. The sudden, uncharacteristic thoughtfulness of the gift had left me feeling off balance, as if the world had suddenly and without warning, tilted on its axis. And it was in that state of emotional disequilibrium that I had made the decision, the simple, innocent and ultimately life-saving decision, that would unravel her entire monstrous and very, very perfect little plan. Later that afternoon I was on the phone with Simone's mother, Brenda. She was a simple, kind woman, a cashier at the local supermarket, a woman who had had a hard life and who, I knew, was often lonely. We were not close, but we were bound by the strange and often challenging reality of our shared daughter. We were talking about our respective medical complaints, as women of a certain age often do, and she had mentioned with a sigh of weary resignation that her own milder case of diabetes had been acting up lately, that she was craving something sweet but knew she couldn't have it. And that's when an idea born of pure, unadulterated and deeply, deeply fortuitous kindness had struck me. "Brenda," I'd said, my voice bright with the pleasure of a sudden and generous impulse. "I have the most wonderful surprise for you. Simone was just here and she brought me a dozen of the most beautiful diabetic-friendly cupcakes. She made them herself with a special low-sugar recipe. I haven't touched them. Why don't I bring them over to you? It's a whole dozen. It's too much for one person anyway. It would be a shame for them to go to waste. Brenda had been so touched, so genuinely and deeply grateful, that it had brought tears to my eyes. "Oh, Helen," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are the kindest woman I know." And so I had done it. I had carefully repacked the beautiful Tiffany blue box, had gotten in my car, and had driven the Trojan horse, the sweet and silent and deeply, deeply poisonous instrument of my own intended murder, directly to the home of my would-be assassin's own mother. I had handed over the box, had accepted her tearful, grateful hug, and had driven home, my heart filled with the quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying warmth of a good deed, done for no other reason than to bring a small, sweet moment of joy into another lonely woman's life. I had no idea that I had not just shared a dessert. I had, in a single, innocent and profoundly, profoundly ironic act of kindness, saved my own life. That evening, alone in the quiet, echoing stillness of my large house, the memory of my late husband, Frank, was a palpable presence. The house itself was a monument to him, to his success, to his fierce and sometimes overbearing protectiveness. He had been a real estate investor, a shrewd and deeply, deeply intelligent man who had built a considerable fortune from nothing. He had been my opposite in almost every way, a pragmatist to my academic, a man of numbers and contracts to my world of books and ideas. But we had loved each other with a deep and quiet and deeply, deeply abiding love. And he had never, not for 1 second, trusted Simone. I sat in his old, worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint, familiar scent of his pipe tobacco, and I remembered the arguments, the quiet, tense conversations we had had about her in the years before he had passed. "She's a barracuda, Helen," he'd say, his voice a low, rumbling growl of a man who had spent his life swimming in the shark-infested waters of the business world. "She's got the smile of an angel and the soul of a predator. All she sees when she looks at Michael is a stepping stone. And all she sees when she looks at us is a bank account." I had always defended her, of course. I had made excuses. I had accused him of being too cynical, too suspicious. "She's just ambitious, Frank," I'd say. "She wants a good life for our son. What's so wrong with that?" "There's nothing wrong with ambition," he'd retort, his eyes, which were as sharp and as discerning as a hawk's, locking onto mine. "But there is something very, very wrong with greed. And that woman is the greediest person I have ever met. She doesn't love our son, Helen. He loves our money. And the second we are gone, she will try to take every last penny of it." His words, which had seemed so harsh, so uncharitable at the time, now echoed in the quiet of my living room with a chilling and deeply, deeply prophetic accuracy. I remembered, with a sudden and painful clarity, the day he had insisted on rewriting his will. We had been to the lawyer's office to see Marcus Thorne, and Frank had been adamant. He had structured his will as an ironclad trust, a legal fortress designed to protect me and my inheritance from any and all challenges. He had made me the sole and lifetime beneficiary. Michael would inherit what was left only after I was gone. "But why, Frank?" I had asked, confused and a little hurt. "Don't you trust our own son?" "I trust our son," he had said, his voice a low, sad and deeply, deeply weary thing. "It's his wife I don't trust. This way she can't get her claws into it. This way you're protected. This way the money, our money, is safe." And then I remembered his other obsession. My diabetes. He had been a relentless and sometimes infuriating guardian of my health. He had educated himself on my condition with the same meticulous and deeply, deeply obsessive attention to detail he applied to his business deals. He knew the science, the symptoms, the dangers. He had been the one who had taught me to be suspicious of quick fixes, of miracle sweeteners, of anything that seemed too good to be true. "There is no magic bullet, Helen," he'd say, his voice a firm and deeply, deeply loving command. "There is only discipline. There is only vigilance. You have to be your own best and most skeptical advocate." Now, sitting in his chair, surrounded by the ghosts of his love and his warnings, the memory of Simone's visit, of her special, custom-made, and diabetic-friendly cupcakes, took on a new and deeply, deeply sinister light. It was all a little too perfect, a little too thoughtful, a little too convenient. A cold and deeply, deeply unsettling feeling began to creep up my spine. It was the old, familiar feeling of a reporter who has just stumbled upon a story that does not add up. It was the feeling of a loose thread, a small and seemingly insignificant detail that, if I pulled on it, might unravel a much larger and much darker tapestry. I pushed the feeling away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was being as cynical and as suspicious as my late husband. I told myself that my daughter-in-law had simply done a kind and thoughtful thing. And I went to bed, my mind a troubled and deeply uneasy sea of doubt. I had no idea that the storm, the full and catastrophic and very real hurricane of her betrayal, was about to make landfall. The phone call came the next morning just as I was finishing my breakfast. It was Simone. Her voice, which had been so sweet, so cloying, so full of a fraudulent saccharine affection the day before, was now a high-pitched and barely controlled instrument of pure, unadulterated eagerness. "Good morning, Helen," she chirped, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "I was just calling to see how you were. Did you sleep well?" There was a strange and deeply unsettling undercurrent to her words, a kind of breathless and very avid anticipation. It was the voice of a person who was not just making polite conversation. It was the voice of a person who was waiting for a very specific and very important piece of news. "I slept fine, Simone," I said, my own voice a little cooler, a little more reserved than I had intended. The unease from the night before had not dissipated with the morning light. It had solidified into a small, hard knot of suspicion in the pit of my stomach. "Oh, good," she'd said, her voice a wave of what sounded like genuine and very strange relief. "That's wonderful." She paused, and then she asked the question, the seemingly innocent and yet deeply loaded question that would be the beginning of the end. "So," she'd said, her voice a low, conspiratorial and deeply eager whisper, "did you get a chance to try the little cakes?" The little cakes. The phrase was so strange, so diminutive, so creepy. It was the kind of phrase a person in a fairy tale would use to describe a poisoned apple. And in that moment, a sudden and very clear and very cold instinct for self-preservation, an instinct I did not know I possessed, took over. I did not know why, I did not have any evidence, I did not have any logical reason, but I knew with a certainty that was as absolute and as terrifying as a law of physics, that I should not, under any circumstances, tell her that I had not eaten her gift. And so I lied. A simple, small, and ultimately life-altering lie. "Oh, they looked so lovely, Simone," I said, my own voice a perfect and deeply fraudulent imitation of cheerful maternal gratitude. "They looked so beautiful that I knew I had to share them. I gave them to your mother." The silence on the other end of the line was the single most terrifying and most illuminating sound I have ever heard. It was not a normal silence. It was a void. A vacuum. A sudden and total and deeply horrified absence of sound. It was the sound of a perfect and very perfect plan, a plan that had been years in the making, a plan that had been executed with a flawless and deeply psychopathic precision, suddenly and catastrophically and very loudly derailing. The silence stretched for a full and very long 5 seconds, and then it was broken by a scream. It was not a loud scream. It was a strangled and deeply desperate and very revealing sound. "You did what?" The words were not a question. They were a raw, naked, and deeply terrified nerve of pure, unadulterated and very incriminating panic. And in that moment, in that single and deeply horrifying and very clarifying scream, I knew. I knew everything. I knew that the cupcakes had not been a gift. I knew that they had not been an act of kindness. I knew that they had been a weapon. A sweet and silent and deeply malevolent weapon. A weapon that had been designed with a cool and calculated and deeply monstrous precision for me and for my diabetes. A weapon that was, at this very moment, in the hands and in the stomach of her own unsuspecting and very vulnerable mother. She tried to backtrack, of course. Her voice, when it came back on the line, was a frantic and deeply unconvincing mess of lies and half-truths. "No, I mean, that's fine, it's just that. I made them especially for your blood sugar levels, not hers. The recipe was calibrated for your specific needs. It might make her feel a little unwell." But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and I had seen for a brief and terrifying and deeply illuminating moment the true and monstrous and very murderous face of my own daughter-in-law. The other shoe dropped less than an hour later. The call was not from Simone or from my son Michael. It was from a frantic and barely coherent neighbor of Brenda Hayes. Brenda, the neighbor, had sobbed down the line, had collapsed. She had been found on the floor of her small apartment, unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin cold and clammy. An ambulance had been called. She had been rushed to the hospital. The paramedics had said something about a seizure, about a state of acute and life-threatening diabetic shock. I hung up the phone, my own hand now as cold and as clammy as Brenda's was reported to be. The pieces of the puzzle, the horrible, monstrous, and deeply, deeply unbelievable pieces were now all on the table. The special, custom-made, and diabetic-friendly cupcakes. The strange and deeply, deeply eager phone call. The raw and deeply, deeply terrified scream of panic. And now this. The sudden and catastrophic and very, very, very nearly fatal illness of the one and only other person who had eaten them. It was not a theory anymore. It was not a suspicion. It was a cold, hard, and deeply, deeply terrifying fact. My daughter-in-law, my son's wife, the woman who had smiled at me, who had hugged me, who had called me family, had tried to kill me. And she had, in her arrogant and beautifully, beautifully foolish and deeply, deeply ironic miscalculation, almost murdered her own mother instead. My mind, the mind of a historian, a mind trained to see patterns, to connect disparate events, to build a narrative from a collection of seemingly random facts, was reeling. But it was also, in a strange and cold and deeply, deeply clarifying way, beginning to work. The grief, the shock, the terror, all of it was being pushed aside by a new and powerful and deeply, deeply familiar instinct. The instinct of a researcher, of an investigator, of a woman who was now faced with the most important and most monstrous story of her entire life. I knew I could not do this alone. I needed an ally. I needed a confidant. I needed someone with a clear and pragmatic and deeply, deeply unsentimental mind. I needed someone who would not think I was crazy, who would not think I was paranoid, who would not think I was a hysterical, grieving old woman. I called my best friend Dorothy Hall. Dorothy and I had been friends for over 40 years. Our lives a shared tapestry of academic life, of raising children, of navigating the quiet and sometimes challenging waters of a long marriage. She had been a nurse, a damn good one, for her entire professional life. A woman with a sharp and deeply, deeply practical mind and a complete and total intolerance for nonsense. I told her everything. I recounted the story from the arrival of the cupcakes to the frantic and deeply, deeply incriminating phone call from Simone, to the final and deeply, deeply horrifying news about Brenda. I laid out the facts, the sequence of events, with the cool, detached precision of a historian presenting a paper at a conference. Dorothy listened, her silence not the silence of disbelief, but of a professional mind at work, gathering data, assessing symptoms, forming a diagnosis. When I was finished, she was quiet for a long and deeply, deeply chilling moment, and then she spoke. And her words, the words of a trained and experienced and deeply, deeply knowledgeable medical professional, were the final and most terrifying confirmation of the truth I had been so desperately and so foolishly trying to deny. "Helen," she said, her voice a low and deeply, deeply grim whisper. "A low-sugar recipe wouldn't do that. Not even to a diabetic. What you are describing, the suddenness, the severity, the seizure, that is not a reaction to a simple sugar mix-up. That sounds like a massive and targeted and chemically induced insulin shock." She paused, and then she asked the question that would be the beginning of my own personal and deeply, deeply necessary investigation. "Tell me," she said, her voice a sharp and deeply, deeply urgent command. "Did you eat any of those cupcakes?" The investigation began not with a bang but with a quiet and deeply, deeply chilling act of preservation. "No," I had whispered to Dorothy, my own voice a raw and ragged thing. "I didn't eat any of them. But I kept one. For myself. For later." "Where is it?" Dorothy had asked, her voice a sharp and urgent command. "It's in the refrigerator," I had said. "In a small plastic container. Don't touch it," she had ordered, her voice now the voice of the nurse who was taking charge of a critical and life-threatening situation. "Don't open it. Don't move it. I am getting in my car and I am driving to your house right now. And then you and I are going to take that cupcake and we are going to drive it to a private and very, very discreet lab I know. And we are going to find out exactly what your daughter-in-law's special recipe is made of." While Dorothy was on her way, I made another and much more difficult call. I called the hospital and I asked for the intensive care unit. I spoke to the charge nurse, a kind and professional and deeply, deeply compassionate woman. I explained that I was a close family friend of Brenda Hayes and I asked about her condition. The nurse's voice was grave. Brenda was, she had said, in a critical but stable condition. She had been brought in a state of severe and unexplained hypoglycemic shock. They were running tests trying to determine the cause. Did she say, I had asked, my own voice a low and trembling thing, what she had eaten before she collapsed? Yes, the nurse had said. She was able to tell the paramedics. She said she had eaten 3 small homemade cupcakes. The final and most damning piece of the puzzle was now in place. When Dorothy arrived, her face a mask of grim and deeply, deeply furious resolve, we did exactly what she had said. We carefully and with the forensic precision of 2 seasoned investigators, packaged the remaining cupcake. It was no longer a dessert. It was evidence. It was Exhibit A in the trial of my own and very, very monstrous daughter-in-law. We drove to the hospital first. Brenda was still in the ICU, a small and frail and deeply, deeply vulnerable figure lost in a tangle of tubes and wires. She was conscious but weak. I told her in the simplest and gentlest terms I could what I suspected. I did not tell her I believed her own daughter had tried to kill me. I simply told her that I believed there had been a terrible and potentially toxic mistake in the recipe. Brenda, in her simple and deeply, deeply trusting way, had just shaken her head. No, she had whispered, her voice a raw and ragged thing. Simone would never. She is a good girl. The denial, the blind and deeply, deeply tragic loyalty of a mother, was a painful and deeply, deeply familiar thing to witness. We then drove to the lab, a small and very discreet facility that Dorothy knew from her years of working with private physicians. We handed over the cupcake and we paid in cash for a full and very, very urgent toxicological screening. The results, they had said, would be ready in 24 hours. The next 24 hours were the longest and most surreal of my entire life. I was a woman living in a nightmare, a quiet and deeply, deeply terrifying suspense film of my own life. And in the middle of that nightmare I was forced to face the other and in some ways more painful betrayal. I was forced to face my son. Michael called me that evening, his voice a frantic and deeply, deeply unconvincing mess of concern and confusion. Simone had, of course, already gotten to him. She had spun her web of lies and he had, as always, walked right into it. Mom, he had said, his voice a rush of panicked and deeply, deeply rehearsed words. Simone told me what happened. About her mom. It's a disaster. She's a complete wreck. She says she must have mixed up the sugar with the special sweetener. She's just devastated. She says she will never forgive herself. I listened, my own heart a cold and heavy and deeply, deeply silent stone in my chest. And Mom, he had continued, his voice now taking on a new and deeply, deeply familiar tone of wheedling and very, very manipulative concern. Simone is worried about you. She said you were very strange on the phone this morning. She's worried that you're not thinking straight, that you're upset, that you're blaming her for what was just a terrible and very, very tragic accident. And there was the gaslighting, the betrayal, the quiet and deeply, deeply cowardly and very, very, very familiar act of a son who was, once again, choosing to protect his monstrous wife over his own, and very, very, very nearly murdered mother. He was not just denying the truth, he was trying to convince me that I was crazy for even suspecting it. The call from the lab came the next afternoon. The voice of the technician was cool, professional, and deeply, deeply chilling. The results of the toxicological screening were, he had said, conclusive. The cupcake had not just been made with the wrong sugar. It had been laced with a significant and clearly, deliberately measured quantity of a very specific and very, very potent prescription medication. A medication that was designed to cause a catastrophic and very, very rapid drop in a person's blood sugar. A medication that, when ingested by a person with a severe and insulin-dependent diabetic condition like myself, would be, in the technician's own cool and deeply, deeply terrifying words, almost certainly and very, very quickly fatal. And the death, he had concluded, would have been almost impossible to distinguish from a natural and very, very tragic medical crisis. The final and most monstrous piece of the puzzle was now in place. This was not just a case of a terrible and very, very tragic accident. This was a case of a cold and calculated and very, very, very nearly successful attempted murder. The meeting with Marcus Thorne was a somber and deeply, deeply surreal affair. I sat in his quiet, book-lined office, the same office where my late husband Frank and I had signed our wills so many years ago, and I laid out the evidence. I gave him the lab report, the sworn testimony from Dorothy, the medical records from Brenda's hospital stay. I was not a grieving widow anymore. I was a client presenting her lawyer with a case, a cold and hard and deeply, deeply monstrous case of attempted murder. Marcus, who had been a friend for over 30 years, who had known my son since he was a baby, read the documents, his face a mask of grim and slowly and deeply and righteously hardening fury. When he was finished, he looked up at me, his eyes, which were usually so warm, so kind, so full of a gentle and deeply, deeply compassionate wisdom, were now as cold and as hard and as deeply, deeply unforgiving as chips of granite. "The woman," he said, his voice a low and controlled and deeply, deeply furious rumble, "is a psychopath. And your son, my dear Helen, is her willing and deeply, deeply cowardly accomplice." He was not just my lawyer anymore. He was my ally. He was the final and most powerful member of my army. "So," he said, his voice now the voice of the legal warrior who was preparing for battle, "what do you want to do? We have enough evidence here to send Simone to prison for a very, very long time. And we have enough to charge your son with conspiracy. All you have to do is say the word, and I will make the call to the district attorney's office right now." The thought of it, the image of my own son, my Michael, in a courtroom on trial in a prison cell, was a pain so profound, so absolute that it was a physical thing. He had betrayed me. He had failed me. He had, in his weakness and his cowardice, been a party to a monstrous and very, very evil act. But he was still my son. "No," I said, my own voice a quiet and deeply, deeply weary thing. "No prison. Not for him. But for her. For her I want something worse." Marcus looked at me, a flicker of a question in his cold, hard eyes. "I do not want to make her a martyr," I said, my own voice now gaining a new and cold and deeply, deeply satisfying strength. "I do not want to make her a tragic and misunderstood figure. I want to make her poor. I want to strip her of the one and only thing she has ever truly loved. I want to take away her access to my money, to my husband's money, to the fortune she was willing to kill for. And I want to do it in a way that is so quiet, so legal, so absolute, that she will never ever be able to touch a single solitary penny of it ever again." A slow and deeply, deeply appreciative smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. He was a man who understood and who deeply, deeply respected the art of a quiet and very, very elegant and deeply, deeply devastating act of revenge. "That," he said, his voice a low and deeply, deeply satisfied purr, "I can most certainly and with the greatest and most profound personal and professional pleasure arrange." The final act of my story was not a loud and dramatic and deeply, deeply satisfying courtroom drama. It was a quiet and cold and deeply, deeply satisfying legal execution. Marcus Thorne, my lawyer, my friend, my weapon, summoned Simone and Michael to his office. They arrived, I was told, arrogant, defensive, and ready to accuse me of slander, of harassment, of being a hysterical and deeply, deeply paranoid old woman. They were not prepared for what they found. They were not prepared for the lab report, the sworn testimony from Dorothy, the medical records from Brenda's hospital stay, all laid out in a neat and deeply, deeply incriminating row on the polished surface of Marcus Thorne's massive mahogany desk. They were not prepared for the quiet and deeply, deeply professional and very, very, very cold fury of a lawyer who was now not just their mother's legal counsel but their accuser, their judge, and their jury. Marcus, I was told, did not raise his voice. He did not make accusations. He simply and with a quiet and devastating and deeply, deeply satisfying precision laid out the facts. He presented them with the irrefutable and deeply, deeply scientific proof of the poison. He presented them with the timeline, with the medical evidence, with the clear and legally actionable case for a multi-felony criminal prosecution for attempted murder. And then he gave them a choice. They could, he had explained, face the consequences. They could face the police, the district attorney, the public, and very, very ugly trial. A trial he had assured them that Simone would, without a single solitary doubt, lose. A trial that would send her to prison for a very, very long time. And a trial that would, in all likelihood, send my son Michael to prison as well as a co-conspirator. Or they could choose the other option. They could sign a document. A simple and quiet and deeply, deeply, deeply and permanently binding legal document. A post-nuptial agreement. An agreement that would, in a single and very, very satisfying stroke of a pen, transfer any and all of my son Michael's current and future inheritance rights from my and my late husband's very considerable estate to a new and very, very, very ironclad charitable trust. A trust that he and his wife could never under any circumstances control or benefit from ever again. It was a beautiful and deeply, deeply elegant choice. A choice between a life of public and very, very certain ruin, and a life of quiet and very, very private financial oblivion. They signed the papers. Of course they did. Simone, faced with the very real and very, very unpleasant prospect of a long and deeply, deeply unfashionable prison sentence, had, I was told, practically snatched the pen from Marcus's hand. And Michael, my son, my weak and cowardly and deeply, deeply, deeply and permanently disappointing son, had simply and quietly and with the trembling and deeply, deeply pathetic hand of a man who had just lost everything, signed his future and his fortune away. Their marriage, a partnership built on the shared and deeply, deeply monstrous promise of my inheritance, did not, I was told, survive the quiet and deeply, deeply devastating ride home from the lawyer's office. The story ends not with a bang but with a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying cup of tea. I was sitting in the small and sunny and deeply, deeply peaceful living room of Brenda Hayes's apartment. She had, after a long and difficult and very, very frightening hospital stay, made a full recovery. I had, of course, told her everything. And she had, after a long and very, very painful and deeply, deeply necessary period of denial, finally and with a quiet and very, very sad and deeply, deeply courageous resolve, accepted the monstrous and very, very unbelievable truth about her own daughter. We were two mothers, two survivors, bound by a single and very, very monstrous act. And we were, in the quiet and sun-drenched and deeply, deeply peaceful aftermath of the storm, finding a new and very, very quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying kind of family in each other. I had brought her a bouquet of flowers and a box of genuinely and very, very safely and deeply, deeply delicious bakery-made treats. And as we sat there in the quiet and comfortable and deeply, deeply ordinary silence of a Tuesday afternoon, I felt a sense of peace, of closure, of a quiet and very, very somber and deeply, deeply satisfying kind of justice. The foundation, the one that would now be the sole and very, very permanent beneficiary of my and my late husband's entire estate, had been established. It was a charitable trust in my late husband's name, dedicated to the two things he had cared about most in the world: diabetes research and the advocacy for and protection of the elderly. It was a legacy, a real legacy, built not on the hollow and shifting and deeply, deeply poisonous sands of greed and entitlement, but on the solid and unshakable and deeply, deeply loving bedrock of a life well lived and a justice in the end well served.